The doctor didn't gasp or jump out of his chair. He didn't call for a nurse or slam the chart onto the desk. Instead, he simply froze. He looked down at the lab report in his hands, read every line one more time, then slowly raised his eyes to meet mine. "Mr. Carter." That was all he said at first. For what felt like forever, he stayed silent. 5 seconds may not sound like much, but when you've got your granddaughter sleeping peacefully against your shoulder, every second stretches into an eternity. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner, the ticking clock on the wall, even my own breathing. Finally, the doctor spoke, carefully choosing every word. "How long has she been drinking that fruit punch?" I looked down at little Emma. She had just turned 8 the week before, and she was curled up against me as if nothing in the world could wake her. This wasn't the kind of nap an energetic little girl should be taking in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't normal. I looked back at the doctor. "I honestly don't know," I answered. "That's why I brought her here." But to explain how I ended up sitting in that exam room, I need to go back a few hours. Emma's birthday had been the previous Saturday. She turned 8 years old, and I wasn't there. Missing it wasn't a choice. I'd spent nearly a week laid up in bed because my lower back had decided it had enough after years of crawling under pickup trucks and rebuilding transmissions. At my age, one wrong twist could put me out of commission for days. By the time I was finally able to move around without wincing every few steps, the birthday party was over. The balloons were gone, the presents had been opened, and my granddaughter had celebrated another year of life without her grandpa beside her. That hurt a whole lot more than my back ever did. I kept imagining her looking toward the front door every few minutes, wondering if I was going to show up. Whether she actually did or not didn't matter. The thought alone was enough to eat at me. So that Wednesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, I got dressed, grabbed the oversized blue gift bag I'd bought earlier in the week, loaded it into my old silver Chevrolet Silverado, and headed toward my son's house in Maple Ridge, about 30 minutes from where I lived. My plan couldn't have been simpler. I'd surprise Emma with her birthday present, take her out for ice cream, let her tell me every little detail about the party I'd missed, and spend the afternoon making up for lost time. I figured being 4 days late was better than not showing up at all. Life has a funny way of taking the smallest plans and turning them into the biggest moments you'll ever live through. When I pulled into the driveway and rang the bell, my daughter-in-law, Melissa, answered while staring down at her phone. She barely glanced at me. "Hey, Melissa," I said with a smile. "Brought something for the birthday girl." Without lifting her eyes from the screen, she stepped aside. "She's upstairs." Then she waved her phone in the air. "I'm on a work call." Before I could say another word, she'd already walked toward the kitchen. I stood in the foyer holding that gift bag, suddenly feeling awkward. There I was, a grandfather who'd missed his granddaughter's birthday and was now trying to make up for it with a stuffed elephant and some wrapping paper. Smooth move, Frank. I climbed the stairs and stopped outside Emma's bedroom. She'd painted the sign on her door herself the summer before. Purple letters. Tiny flowers. Emma's room. Underneath she'd carefully written, "Please knock." I smiled and tapped lightly. "Hey, sweetheart. Grandpa's here." Nothing. I knocked again. A few seconds later I heard slow footsteps. The door cracked open. The second I saw her, something inside me tightened. She didn't look sick exactly. No runny nose. No flushed cheeks. No coughing. It was something else. Her eyes looked heavy, almost glazed over, and she moved like every motion took twice the effort it should have. "Grandpa." She smiled, but even the smile seemed delayed, almost like it had to travel through thick fog before reaching her face. I crouched down until we were eye level. "Happy birthday, kiddo." She leaned against the doorframe. "I'm kinda tired." "Tired?" I checked my watch. It wasn't even 2:30. Normally she'd be bouncing around the house, asking 1,000 questions or showing me whatever new game she was obsessed with. Instead, she could barely keep herself standing. I stepped into her room and handed her the gift bag. She opened it slowly, far slower than any 8-year-old I'd ever met. When she finally pulled out the stuffed elephant, though, her face brightened. A genuine smile spread across her cheeks. "I'm gonna call her Daisy," she whispered. "I think Daisy's the perfect name." She hugged the toy against her chest, then carefully placed it on the middle of her pillow like she'd already picked out its permanent spot. For a few seconds she didn't say anything. She just stared at it. Then she looked back at me. She leaned in until only I could hear her. Both of her tiny hands rested on my knee. "Grandpa." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you tell Mommy to stop putting medicine in my juice?" I didn't react. At least not on the outside. Years of fixing engines had taught me something important. When something suddenly sounds wrong, you don't panic. You listen. You pay attention. You gather every piece before making your move. So I simply nodded. "What kind of medicine, sweetheart?" She shrugged. "I don't know." She looked down at the floor. "It makes me sleepy, and I don't like it." Every alarm bell inside my head started ringing. I stood up and gently held out my hand. "Come on." She slipped her small hand into mine without asking a single question. "We're going to take a little drive." As we walked downstairs, Melissa was still pacing around the kitchen with her phone pressed against her ear. She was laughing. "I'm taking Emma out for a birthday treat," I said. "We'll grab some ice cream." Without even looking in our direction, she waved her hand. "Sure. That's fine." That was it. No questions. No concern. No reminder about dinner. Nothing. I buckled Emma into the back seat of my Silverado, making sure her booster seat was secure. She'd once told me she liked sitting higher because it made her feel like she was riding in a parade. I smiled, remembering that. Then I started the truck. I didn't call my son. Not yet. I didn't dial the police either. First, I needed answers. Real answers. The pediatric urgent care clinic across town had treated Emma before, and I trusted the physician there. If something was wrong, I knew he'd tell me straight. The waiting room felt quieter than usual, even though people were coming and going around us. Emma sat beside me for maybe 10 minutes before climbing into my lap. She rested her head against my chest, hugged Daisy close, and within seconds she was asleep again. Not drifting off. Not getting comfortable. She was simply out. I'd raised a son, helped take care of nieces and nephews, and spent enough years around kids to know what normal looked like. Healthy children don't just shut down in the middle of the afternoon over and over again. That was the moment my worry turned into something much heavier. A nurse eventually called Emma's name, and we followed her into one of the exam rooms. After checking Emma's temperature and blood pressure, she asked a few routine questions before leaving us alone. A few minutes later, Dr. Nathan Brooks walked in carrying a tablet. He smiled politely. "Good to see you again, Mr. Carter. I wish it were under better circumstances." "So do I." He crouched beside Emma, who had barely opened her eyes. "Hey there, kiddo." She offered a weak little wave before resting her head against my shoulder again. That caught his attention immediately. "When did she start acting like this?" he asked. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I explained how I'd missed her birthday because of my back, how I'd stopped by to surprise her, and how she'd quietly asked me to tell her mother to stop putting medicine in her juice because it made her sleepy. I repeated her exact words. Every one of them. Dr. Brooks never interrupted me. He didn't dismiss what I was saying or suggest I was reading too much into it. Instead, he listened carefully while occasionally making notes on the tablet. When I finished, he looked over at Emma. She was trying to nibble on a couple of crackers the nurse had brought in, but even chewing seemed to take effort. He stood up. "I'd like to run some tests." "What kind?" "A urine screening, blood work, and a toxicology panel." My stomach tightened. "You really think that's necessary?" "I do." There wasn't an ounce of hesitation in his voice. "We'll know a lot more once the results come back." They took Emma down the hall while I stayed behind. Those 40 minutes felt longer than entire workdays I'd spent rebuilding diesel engines in July heat. Every possible explanation ran through my head. Maybe it really was allergy medicine. Maybe she'd accidentally gotten into something. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent reason for all of this. I wanted one of those explanations to be true. More than anything. When Emma came back, she climbed onto the examination table, leaned against me, and fell asleep almost immediately. Again. No tossing. No getting comfortable. Just asleep. I couldn't stop staring at her. Her breathing stayed slow and steady, but seeing an energetic little girl lose consciousness that easily made my chest feel tighter every minute. I kept thinking about something else too. What if I hadn't come today? What if I'd decided to wait until the weekend because I was still sore? Would anyone have noticed? Or would everyone have kept calling it a phase? The door opened. Dr. Brooks stepped inside carrying several printed pages. He stopped halfway across the room. Looked down. Read them once more. Then looked back at me. That's when everything changed. "Mr. Carter." His voice had become noticeably quieter. "How long has this been going on?" "I wish I knew." He pulled up a chair beside mine and placed the paperwork where I could see it. The toxicology screen detected diphenhydramine. I frowned. "I'm not following." "It's the active ingredient in children's allergy medication." I nodded slowly. "So, Benadryl." "Exactly." He tapped one section of the report. "The concentration we're seeing isn't consistent with one accidental dose." He paused before continuing. "It suggests repeated administration over an extended period." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. The words refused to make sense. Repeated. Extended. Intentional. Those weren't words any grandparent ever expects to see connected to their grandchild. I folded the report and placed it back on the desk because my hands had started trembling. Could this happen by accident? He gently shook his head. "Not with these levels." Silence filled the room. Finally he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Is her mother with her most days?" "Yes." "And her father?" "My son travels quite a bit for work." He nodded as though another piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. "I have a legal obligation to report suspected child endangerment." "I understand." He watched me carefully. "I need one favor." He didn't answer. "I need 24 hours. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "I know how that sounds, Doctor." I leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to ignore this. I'm asking you to let me make sure my granddaughter is somewhere safe before this explodes." He remained silent for several long moments. Finally he sighed. "Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. If I haven't heard from you by then, I file the report immediately." "You have my word." He extended his hand. "So do you." We shook hands. When I carried Emma back to my truck, she never woke up. She wrapped one arm around Daisy and slept the entire drive home. Not once did she stir. Not when I hit a pothole. Not when I stopped for a red light. Not even when I carried her into my guest room. I laid her down gently, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and watched her sleep for a long time. Natural sleep is peaceful. This didn't feel peaceful. It felt stolen. That night I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I sat alone in my recliner with a cup of coffee that turned cold hours before I ever took a second sip. When I rebuilt an engine, I never started by replacing random parts. First I figured out exactly what had failed. Then I traced back to the cause. I approached this the same way. What did I actually know? Emma had been exposed to medication repeatedly. Someone had been giving it to her. Someone she trusted. The question wasn't whether it happened. The medical report answered that. The real question was why. Nothing about it made sense. No loving parent would intentionally keep their child sedated without a serious medical reason. And as far as I knew, there wasn't one. Around 7 the next morning, I finally picked up my phone and called my son, Ryan. He answered almost immediately. "Morning, Dad. You already at work?" "Just making coffee. Everything okay?" I kept my voice calm. "How's Emma been lately?" There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "Has she seemed different?" He thought for a moment. "She's been sleeping a lot recently." Another pause. Melissa figured she was hitting a growth spurt. Growth spurt. Those two words settled in my stomach like a rock. "I've been thinking about making up for missing her birthday," I said casually. "Would you mind if she stayed with me for a week?" He laughed softly. "She'd absolutely love that. I'll check with Melissa, but I don't see why she'd have a problem with it." "Thanks, son." After hanging up, I stared out the living room window for several minutes. Ryan wasn't a bad father. Not even close. He'd simply trusted the wrong person. Sometimes trust can blind you just as effectively as a blindfold. And I was beginning to realize just how blind all of us had been. I wasn't about to waste any more time. By 9 that morning, I was sitting across from a family attorney named Richard Lawson. Years earlier, he'd handled some paperwork after my late wife's estate was settled, and I'd never forgotten how direct he was. Richard wasn't the kind of lawyer who filled the room with fancy words. He listened, studied the facts, and got straight to the point. I laid everything on his desk. The doctor's report. The toxicology results. The notes I'd written during the night. Even the photos I'd taken of the paperwork before leaving the clinic. He didn't interrupt once. For nearly 4 minutes, he quietly read every page. Finally, he removed his reading glasses and looked directly at me. "Frank," he said, "do you understand how serious this is?" "I do." "This could easily become a child endangerment case." "I figured as much." He folded his hands together. "Who knows about this besides you and the physician?" "My son doesn't." "And Melissa?" "No." He nodded slowly. "That's the right decision, for now." I raised an eyebrow. "You only get one chance to present evidence like this to a husband," Richard explained. "If you go in with suspicions instead of proof, there's a good chance he'll convince himself there's another explanation." He leaned back. "You need facts that leave absolutely no room for doubt." I couldn't argue with that. "So what comes next?" He reached into a drawer and slid a business card across his desk. On the front was printed, "Michael Grant, licensed private investigator." "He's discreet," Richard said. "And thorough." I slipped the card into my wallet. "Anything else?" Richard nodded. "If your son agrees to let Emma stay with you, don't hesitate." "I already asked." "And?" "He's checking with Melissa." "Good." His expression hardened. "The longer that little girl stays out of that house, the better." Ryan called me a little before lunchtime. "Melissa thinks it'd be good for Emma to spend some time with you." "Really?" "Yeah." He chuckled. "She said a change of scenery might do Emma some good." Those words stuck with me. A change of scenery. No hesitation. No questions. No concern about how long she'd be gone. Just, sure. That alone didn't prove anything. But I filed it away anyway. A few hours later I pulled into their driveway. Emma was already waiting outside with her little backpack. Daisy was tucked tightly beneath one arm. She climbed into my truck with the biggest smile I'd seen on her face in days. "Are we going on an adventure?" "The best one," I answered. She grinned. "I knew it." As we drove away, I glanced toward the front door. Melissa never came outside. She never waved. Never said goodbye. Never even looked through the window. I found that strange. Maybe someone else wouldn't have. I did. Over the next 24 hours, Emma slowly began acting like herself again. She laughed. She colored pictures at my kitchen table. She followed me around the garage while I replaced the brakes on my old pickup. She asked 100 questions. The difference was impossible to ignore. She still got tired in the evenings like any kid her age. But she wasn't falling asleep at random anymore. She wasn't stumbling through the day with half-open eyes. Watching that happen made something inside me hurt even more, because it confirmed what I was already beginning to suspect. Whatever had been happening, it wasn't happening under my roof. Thursday evening my phone rang. "Mr. Carter? This is Frank. It's Michael Grant." His voice was calm. "I've got something you should see." "When?" "The Riverside Diner off Highway 12. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "I'll see you then." He was already seated when I arrived. Average height. Gray jacket. Quiet eyes. The kind of man you'd probably walk past in a grocery store without remembering his face 5 seconds later. He ordered black coffee, then slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "I think you'll want to look through these." Inside were photographs. Dozens of them. Every picture carried a date and timestamp. None of them were blurry. None left room for interpretation. Melissa appeared in every one, standing beside a man I'd never seen before. Sometimes they were leaving restaurants. Other times they were entering hotels. One picture showed them holding hands while walking through a parking garage. Another showed them kissing outside an upscale apartment building. I turned another page. Hotel receipts. Parking records. Copies of surveillance photographs. Michael had done exactly what Richard promised. Everything was documented. "The man's name is Tyler Bennett," he explained. 40 years old. What does he do? Medical equipment sales. How long? Michael took a slow sip of coffee. At least 9 months. 9 months. I stared down at the photographs. Ryan had spent nearly that entire period traveling for work, trying to provide for his family, working overtime, flying across the country. Meanwhile, his wife had been building another life behind his back. I swallowed hard. What about Emma? Michael grew quiet. I haven't found any evidence he ever harmed her. But, he sighed. The timeline of your granddaughter's symptoms appears to match the period when Melissa and Tyler started seeing each other more frequently. I already knew what he meant before he said it. You're thinking she wanted Emma asleep. I can't prove motive. He chose every word carefully. But the timing fits. I slowly closed the folder. Convenience. That's what this looked like. Not rage. Not revenge. Convenience. That realization made me feel even sicker. Hurting a child because they're standing between you and what you want. I honestly couldn't imagine anything much lower than that. What does Tyler know? Michael shrugged. He knows Emma exists. And he was told she's difficult. I frowned. Did he ever ask questions? No, not one. He accepted the explanation and kept living his life. Whether that made him guilty or simply cowardly, I wasn't sure. Either way, he'd looked the other direction. I paid the check before Michael could reach for it. As we stood outside, cool autumn air drifted across the parking lot. "I'll keep documenting everything," he said. "I'll need it." "You'll have it." We shook hands. Then I climbed into my truck. The drive home felt longer than usual. The trees lining the road had started changing colors, filling the hills with shades of orange and gold. Normally, I'd appreciate a view like that. That evening, I barely noticed. When I got home, Emma was asleep in my guest bedroom. This time, though, her sleep looked peaceful, natural. She wasn't fighting to stay awake anymore. She wasn't collapsing from exhaustion in the middle of the afternoon. She simply looked like a little girl who'd spent the day playing. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching her breathe. Then I walked into the kitchen, opened a spiral notebook I'd used for years to keep repair records, and started building another kind of file. Dates, times, medical reports, phone calls, observations. Every detail went onto those pages. When I finished, I picked up the phone and called Richard. "We're ready," I told him. Then I made one more call. Ryan answered after 2 rings. "Dad, I need you to come over tomorrow night." There was a pause. "Is everything okay?" "No." I looked toward the hallway where Emma was sleeping. "But it will be." Ryan pulled into my driveway just before 6 on Friday evening. His dark SUV rolled to a stop, and he walked toward the front porch looking completely relaxed. He carried his laptop bag over one shoulder, still dressed in work clothes, with no clue that his entire world was about to change. Emma was already asleep in the guest room. I wanted to make sure she never heard a single word of what was coming. I'd spent the afternoon making one of Ryan's favorite meals, slow-cooked beef roast, mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and homemade biscuits. Ever since he was a teenager, I'd always cooked that dinner whenever life knocked him down. I never explained the tradition. I just did it. He stepped inside and smiled. "Smells incredible in here. Figured you might be hungry." He glanced toward the hallway. "Emma already asleep?" "Yeah. She had a busy day." He smiled. "She seems happier since she's been here." "She does." We sat down and ate together. For almost half an hour, we talked about ordinary things. His latest work trip, football, the old truck sitting in my garage, the weather. I let him relax. I let him enjoy one last peaceful meal before everything changed. When we finished eating, I carried our empty plates into the kitchen and returned with 3 folders. Without saying a word, I placed them on the table between us. Ryan looked down. "What's all this?" "Read." He opened the first folder. Inside were the medical reports from Dr. Brooks. His eyes moved slowly across each page. Then he picked up the toxicology results. The color gradually drained from his face. He didn't say anything. He simply reached for the 3rd folder. The photographs. After seeing only a handful of pictures, he quietly closed it. The kitchen became completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming across the room. Ryan stood up without saying a word. "Excuse me." He walked down the hallway toward the bathroom and gently shut the door behind him. I stayed exactly where I was. There wasn't anything I could say that would make those papers hurt less. 7, maybe 8 minutes passed before he finally came back. His eyes were red. He'd clearly cried. Still, when he sat down again, his voice stayed steady. "Does Emma know?" "No." "Does she know what was in the juice?" I slowly shook my head. "She only knows it made her sleepy." He lowered his head for a few seconds. Good. His jaw tightened. She shouldn't have to carry any more than that. At that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in days. Not the exhausted businessman. Not the husband whose trust had been shattered. I saw a father. A father whose first thought wasn't revenge. It was protecting his little girl. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "Since Wednesday." He stared at me. "You've been carrying this by yourself?" I wanted evidence. I tapped the folders. I wasn't about to hand you suspicions. I wanted facts. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "You rebuilt the whole case before bringing it to me." I couldn't help giving a tired smile. Old habits. For years I'd rebuilt engines one bolt at a time. Turns out the same kind of patience worked outside the garage too. Ryan picked up his phone. "I need Richard's number." I handed him the business card. He slipped it into his wallet without another word. That night he stayed at my house. Neither of us slept much. The next morning we made pancakes with Emma. She proudly helped stir the batter and laughed when flour ended up on both of our shirts. Ryan hardly took his eyes off her. It was as if he were trying to memorize every smile she'd ever given him. By Sunday afternoon, he'd already spoken with Richard twice. He quietly moved money into a separate account, copied important financial records, photographed documents inside the Home Office. He never confronted Melissa. Not yet. Everything was done carefully, methodically. He wanted every step to count. Monday morning arrived. After I dropped Emma off at school and watched her walk safely into the building, Ryan drove home alone. Melissa was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a cup of coffee beside her. She smiled when he walked in. "You're home early." He didn't answer. Instead, he sat across from her and placed the medical report on the counter. She looked down, then back at him. The smile disappeared almost instantly. She started talking before he'd even spoken. "Ryan, I can explain. That was her first mistake." She assumed she knew what he'd discovered. He remained completely silent. For nearly 10 seconds. Then he calmly placed the toxicology report beside the first document. She stopped talking. Finally, he slid the photographs across the countertop. She looked at the first picture, then the second. Every bit of color drained from her face. "I trusted you," Ryan said quietly. His voice never rose. Not once. "I trusted you with our daughter." He slid another photograph toward her. "I trusted you with our marriage." Another. "I trusted you with my entire life." She immediately began crying. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He simply watched her. "I love Emma. You drugged her. I never wanted to hurt her. You gave our daughter medication over and over so she'd stay asleep." Tears streamed down her face. "I just needed time." Those 4 words hung in the room like smoke. Time. She'd traded a child's well-being for convenience. Ryan slowly stood. He picked up his truck keys. She reached toward him. "Please don't leave." He stepped back. "I already lost my wife." She froze. "What you're losing now?" He paused. "You chose to lose." Without another word, he walked out the front door. She never followed him. She never called after him. She simply remained standing in that kitchen, surrounded by the evidence she could no longer explain away. That evening Ryan came back to my house. Neither of us talked much. There wasn't much left to say. Some truths don't need long conversations. They simply change everything the moment they're uncovered. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic the way television makes these things look. There were no screaming matches in the front yard. No police cars with flashing lights parked outside the house. No neighbors gathering at their windows. Real life doesn't usually unfold that way. Instead, it moved slowly. One appointment after another. Stacks of paperwork. Phone calls. Meetings. More waiting than I ever imagined. Richard immediately filed for emergency custody on Ryan's behalf, using every piece of documentation we'd collected. The medical records, toxicology results, photographs, witness statements, and my written timeline all became part of the case. Dr. Brooks also submitted his official report to Child Protective Services exactly as he promised. The investigation began almost immediately. Social workers interviewed everyone. Ryan, me, Emma's teachers, neighbors, even Emma herself, although they were incredibly careful about the questions they asked. They didn't pressure her or try to make her relive anything. Their only concern was making sure she felt safe. By then she'd been staying with me for nearly 2 weeks. The difference in her was impossible to ignore. She laughed constantly. She played outside until the sun started going down. She helped me wash my truck every Saturday morning, even though she usually splashed more water on herself than the truck. Most importantly, she stayed awake. She wasn't nodding off halfway through lunch anymore. She wasn't dragging herself through the afternoons. She looked like a healthy little girl again. Every person involved in the investigation noticed it. Melissa hired an attorney almost immediately. According to Richard, that wasn't unusual. People fight hardest when they know they're losing, he told me. The first hearing came sooner than I expected. Ryan sat beside Richard while I sat a few rows behind them. Melissa avoided looking at either of us. She appeared exhausted. The confident woman who always looked perfectly put together had vanished. Her attorney argued that she'd been overwhelmed. She'd been under tremendous emotional stress. She'd struggled with anxiety. She'd made poor decisions while trying to balance work and parenting. Richard listened patiently. Then he stood. He didn't attack her character. He didn't raise his voice. He simply introduced the evidence. First came Dr. Brooks' testimony. The doctor calmly explained the toxicology findings to the judge, making it clear that the medication levels couldn't have resulted from an isolated mistake. Then came the pharmacy records. Months of purchases. Consistent. Documented. Easy to follow. After that, Richard introduced the timeline I'd kept in my notebook. Every observation. Every phone call. Every doctor's visit. Every date matched perfectly. Finally, he presented Michael Grant's investigation. The photographs. The hotel records. The surveillance logs. Everything lined up. The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge carefully reviewed every document before speaking. Based on the evidence presented, temporary sole custody of Emma would remain with Ryan. Melissa would receive supervised visitation only until the investigation concluded. I watched Ryan lower his head for a moment. Not because he'd won. Because he'd finally been able to protect his daughter. There's a difference. The criminal investigation continued separately. Detectives interviewed Tyler Bennett within days. According to the investigator, he cooperated almost immediately. He turned over text messages, phone records, hotel confirmations, everything they requested. Whether he did it because he felt guilty or because he wanted to save himself, I honestly don't know. Either way, the truth came out faster because of it. He admitted Melissa often complained that Emma interrupted their time together. He said she'd referred to her daughter as impossible to manage more than once. Hearing that made my stomach turn. Children aren't interruptions. They're the reason you're supposed to become a better adult. A few months later, Ryan officially filed for divorce. The house they'd spent years decorating eventually went on the market. The family photographs disappeared from the walls. The carefully landscaped yard belonged to someone else before winter arrived. Social media went quiet too. The endless pictures of smiling breakfasts, holiday decorations, and picture-perfect family moments simply stopped. Looking back, I realized those photographs had only captured appearances. They'd never shown what was actually happening inside that house. Emma continued living with us while everything worked its way through the courts. Our routine settled into something wonderfully ordinary. Every morning I'd make pancakes or scrambled eggs while she packed her backpack. After school she'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I tinkered with whatever old engine happened to be sitting in my garage. Sometimes she'd hand me wrenches. Sometimes she'd simply sit nearby talking non-stop about school, friends, or whatever book she was reading that week. Those conversations became my favorite part of every day. Little by little, the shadows left her eyes. One evening she looked up from coloring and asked me something that nearly broke my heart. "Grandpa." "Yeah, sweetheart. My juice tastes different here." I smiled gently. "That's because it's just juice." She thought about that for a second. "I like this better." She went right back to coloring. Kids have a way of saying enormous things with the smallest sentences. I had to excuse myself for a minute after that. Not because I wanted anyone to see me cry. Because some moments deserve privacy. One afternoon Ryan stopped by after work. Emma was outside chasing butterflies with Daisy tucked under one arm. He watched her through the kitchen window for a long time. Then he quietly said something I'll never forget. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed." I put a hand on his shoulder. "You trusted your wife. I should have noticed. You trusted someone you loved." He stared out the window. "That's different." "It is. Guilt won't help Emma." "What will help her?" I nodded toward the backyard. "Is the father who's standing here now." He smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile. Not a forced one. "I won't miss another sign." I know. And I believed him. Some people break after the truth comes out. Others become stronger because of it. My son chose the second path. It took several more months before everything was officially over. The final custody hearing was nothing like the emotional courtroom scenes you see in movies. There weren't dramatic speeches. Nobody stormed out. Nobody suddenly confessed to anything. Instead, it was quiet, professional, methodical. The judge had already reviewed hundreds of pages of reports before anyone walked into that courtroom. By the time the hearing ended, the decision was clear. Ryan was awarded full legal and physical custody of Emma. Melissa was granted only supervised visitation, with strict conditions that had to be met before anything could ever change. The criminal case moved forward separately. The evidence spoke louder than anyone's excuses ever could. The repeated use of medication, the pharmacy records, the doctor's testimony, and the investigation all pointed to the same conclusion. Choices had consequences. For the first time in months, I finally felt like Emma was truly safe. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Ryan transferred to a position that required far less travel. He wanted to be home every evening. No more weeks spent in hotels. No more missing birthdays or school events. He became the father he'd always wanted to be, now with both eyes wide open. Emma moved into a cheerful bedroom at Ryan's new house just a few miles from mine. She insisted Daisy, the elephant, sat in the exact center of her bed every single morning before school. Some habits are worth keeping. Every Friday became Grandpa night. She'd spend the evening at my place. Sometimes we'd order pizza. Sometimes we'd grill burgers in the backyard. Other nights we'd sit in the garage while I worked on an old truck and she'd hand me tools that were usually the wrong size. She always laughed when I pretended not to notice. Those evenings reminded me how healing doesn't usually arrive all at once. It comes through ordinary moments. Shared meals. Long conversations. Safe routines. The little things people often take for granted. One afternoon nearly a year after everything happened, Emma and I were driving back from the county fair. She was talking non-stop about the giant stuffed bear she'd won trying to knock over milk bottles. Halfway through the ride she became unusually quiet. She looked out the passenger window for a while before speaking. "Grandpa." "Yeah, sweetheart. Do you remember when I used to be sleepy all the time?" I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "I do." She looked down at Daisy, who was still riding everywhere with her. "I don't really remember much." I smiled gently. "That's okay." She looked back at me. "I just remember you coming to get me." For a second I couldn't find any words. Then I reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'll always come get you." She smiled. "I know. Kids have a way of saying exactly what matters most without realizing it." A few weeks later, Ryan and I were sitting on my back porch after Emma had gone inside to watch a movie. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange behind the trees. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he broke the silence. "I still think about how close I came to missing it." I nodded. "So do I. If you hadn't stopped by that day." He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew exactly where his thoughts had gone. I looked out across the yard before answering. Sometimes life gives you one chance. One ordinary decision changes everything. He looked over at me. "You almost skipped going over there because your back hurt." "I know. But you didn't." "No. I guess that's what saved her." I thought about that for a long moment. Maybe it did. Or maybe it wasn't just one decision. Maybe it was a lifetime of paying attention. Years spent fixing machines had taught me something that turned out to matter far beyond engines. Little problems almost always show themselves before they become big ones. You just have to notice them. And when something feels wrong, you don't ignore it. You don't explain it away because it's inconvenient. You don't assume someone else has it handled. You ask questions. You keep asking until the answers make sense. That's exactly what happened with Emma. One quiet sentence from an 8-year-old little girl changed everything. Most adults probably would have smiled, assumed she was imagining things, and moved on. I couldn't. Something in my gut refused to let it go. Looking back now, I'm thankful I listened. Not because it made me some kind of hero. I'm not. I'm just a grandfather who loved his granddaughter enough to pay attention. Sometimes that's all it takes. People have asked me if I hate Melissa. The truth surprises them. No. I don't spend my days carrying hatred around. Hate is heavy. It steals time from the people who actually deserve it. What I feel is sadness. Sadness that a little girl had to learn far too early that adults sometimes make terrible choices. Sadness that my son had to rebuild his life after discovering the person he trusted most had betrayed him. But alongside that sadness sits gratitude. Gratitude that Emma was still young enough to recover. Gratitude that one whispered sentence was heard by the right person. Gratitude that truth eventually finds its way into the light. Today Emma is thriving. She's doing well in school. She plays soccer every fall, takes piano lessons on Tuesdays, and still insists on bringing Daisy whenever we go on road trips. Ryan smiles more now than I've seen him smile in years. As for me, I'm back in my garage most afternoons, rebuilding old engines and drinking coffee that's usually gone cold before I remember it's there. Life isn't perfect. It never will be. But it's honest. It's peaceful. And every time I hear Emma laughing somewhere in the yard, I remind myself that sometimes the biggest victories don't come with applause or headlines. Sometimes they arrive quietly. in the form of a child who finally feels safe enough to simply be a kid again. If this experience taught me anything, it's this: never ignore the small warning signs. Trust is important, but paying attention is even more important. One caring conversation, one extra question, or one unexpected visit can completely change someone's future. And if you're lucky enough to have people you love, don't assume they'll always tell you when something is wrong. Sometimes they're hoping you'll notice before they have to ask for help. That's exactly what Emma did. And I'll always be grateful that, on one ordinary Wednesday afternoon, I was listening.